Hello everyone. Madeline from Dribble here. How's it going? I love to see where you're all joining from in the chat. Put where you're joining from, put what time it is for you. Is anyone staying up super late for this webinar? We've got Hi Eve from Germany. I'm from Canada on the West Coast. Hayden in the Big Smoke, 5 p.m. Argentina, I love that this is such an international bunch. This is going to be a great hour and a half panel discussion. Arkansas, Portugal, Los Angeles. Hi, Michael from Madrid. Wow. That's what's so great about these online sessions and webinars. You get such an international crowd. Awesome. Is it super late for anyone? Is anyone staying up? Is it midnight there? Use the chat to get to know each other. Put your Dribble usernames in the chat. This is going to be a super interactive event, so use the chat to get to know each other and network a bit. So welcome everybody. We're so glad to have you here with us today for our panel discussion with Editor X. Digital Design in 2022, How to Grow as a Creator. Super excited for this one. To mark the release of the latest Editor X Trends report, the team has joined forces with us here at Dribble for this in-depth session on the latest developments in digital design. In today's session, you'll get the chance to hear from a curated panel of industry experts at the forefront of all things design. So this should be really interesting. I've got a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So like I said, say hi in the chat, use it to get to know each other. These events are super fun, super interactive. We'll also be doing a lot of Q&A during this session. I see a few people have found the Q&A already, but in the Q&A tab to the right of the chat tab, pop your questions in there. Don't dilute the chat with your questions, pop them in the Q&A tab, and also use the plus button to upvote other people's questions. So the more votes the question has, it will rise to the top of the question pile and it will get answered. So make sure you go to the Q&A, pop your question in, and upvote other people's questions. We'll have some polls throughout the session. So I've actually got a poll now that I'd love to ask you guys. It'll be great to hear what sort of audience makeup we have. So what area of digital design is your focus? We've got product design, web design, graphic design, UI UX design, and I don't work in digital design. So head to the poll tab and vote on what you are. We've got a lot of graphic designers. Okay. 38% graphic design leading at the moment, only 5% product design, only 5% don't work in design. That's great to see. We've got a very design focused crowd. And then 27% UI UX design and 27% web design. Awesome. That's great to see. This session is also going to be extremely interactive, like I said, and there might be some times where you get to come up onto stage and speak to the panelists and ask your questions face to face. So that's with your camera on and that's with your microphone on. So if you want to do so, raise your hand in the question and answer portion of the chat that says, hey, I want to come up onto stage. I've got a question that I want to ask face to face, and then we'll bring you up onto stage and see your face and hear your voice. If you run into any technical issues at all, just DM me or tag me in the help chat. I'm here throughout the whole event to help you. And if you're sharing this on social media, remember to tag EditorX, tag Dribble. We love to see how you're watching these events. Lastly, I see some questions in the Q&A already about this, but this workshop is being recorded. So feel free to get up, stretch your legs. You won't miss anything. EditorX is going to send the recording and the slides that are being shared tomorrow. So you're going to get the recording tomorrow. Okay, so without further ado, I would love to welcome Lily Smith, who's the senior editor of Shaping Design at EditorX. Prior to this, she was a design reporter with over 400 bylines at a renowned business magazine, Fast Company, as well as AIGA, Ion Design, and Design Observer. So excited to have her here with us today. And without further ado, take it away, Lily.
Thanks, Madeline. Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're able to take time out of your day and join us today. Madeline already did a great job of introing me, but I'll go ahead and add a little bit to that. My name is Lily Smith. I'm going to be moderating today's panel on the day-to-day. As Madeline mentioned, I'm the senior editor of Shaping Design by Editor X. It's really the blog for professional designers to find everything they need to stay ahead of the curve in one place: inspiration, insight, technical know-how to build incredible websites. And if you're not familiar with Editor X, it's an advanced creation platform for professional designers. The platform enables designers to create cutting-edge, responsive websites. The most simple way to think about it is without the training wheels. So now on to why we're here today. Earlier this month, Editor X launched its mid-year digital design trend report, which included some of the biggest trends impacting designers so far this year. There are 7 there in total, but think, Y2K aesthetics, bright, splashy color use, 3D interactive elements, the metaverse, things that are really impacting designers on the day-to-day. So I'd encourage all of you to give it a read over on the Shaping Design blog. And if you're interested in how we built it, we have you covered there too. There will be a how-to workshop with our designers on August 3rd. So look out for that email as well. But today we are using the trend report really as a launching pad to talk about the implications of those trends and how designers can navigate an industry in flux, with insight from this incredible panel who will introduce themselves in just a minute. There will be a 20-minute or so Q&A at the end, as Madeline kindly mentioned. So be sure to drop your questions in the chat box and we will get to as many as we can before we wrap up. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started and introduce the panel. Talia, I will start with you if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Talia. I think I have about 10 or 15 minutes to sort of kick this off. So there are a few slides. Madeline, if you want to go ahead and share my screen, we'll get that started. Amazing. All right. So this is a really rapid. You guys came here for a panel, but there is just a little bit of time at the beginning to have a super quick talk called "How I Became a Designer / Coder and Other Common Questions I Wish I Knew the Answers to Not So Very Long Ago, but instead had to figure them out myself because designing with code literally wasn't a thing." So we'll talk a little bit about all of that within, I hope, 15 or so minutes. Okay, let's kicking this thing off. Just right off the bat, I am a designer coder. Duh, that's why we're all here today. One of the biggest questions that I always get, and that I've always gotten from day one of being a designer coder, is, okay, so great, but would you consider yourself to be more of a designer or coder? Do you develop websites or do you design websites? Another way to phrase this question is, do we need a better name to describe the job that you do? And it actually took me a really long time, like several years, to come up with the right answer to this question, because it needs to get that sort of subtlety of combining these two in a way that people haven't really heard yet before. My answer to this question is now always, I am a designer first and foremost, and my medium is coding. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. So that means sometimes I make just websites. This is a website that for Earth Day, for Google Arts and Culture, a couple years back, we had to create a website that was meant to visualize the microplastic particles in the air. This was the website. We're not going to go into detail, but it was a nice little beautiful interactive experience that was designed to be beautiful so that it would be shared, so that it would spread the word about microplastic particles in the air. This was just a take of all the many different skies that the website pictured, just so that it made it a little bit more relatable for people as they're visiting this website. So sometimes I make websites. They're not your average websites that you see all the time. It doesn't really have your typical navigation bar at the top or whatever, or footer at the bottom of the page. I do those too, but when I talk about the websites that I design, it really is using the web as a tool for design. Sometimes, on the other end of the spectrum, I make just brands. A few years ago, when I was working at Champions Design, I was a part of the Carnegie Hall rebrand project. Now, Carnegie Hall, for those of you who know it, it is a giant age-old musical institution, concert hall here in New York City. And this is the building. This has always been the building. It's this beautiful, regal brick and mortar location. Carnegie Hall is not the type of brand that needs a coded anything. It barely even needs a website. It needs a beautiful logo. The logo that we designed was inspired by the stained glass window on the outside of the facade that has the words Carnegie Hall written in there, and always has been. We also came up with a whole system that was supposed to look a little musical, was supposed to be applied to all the things that they do. Does not need code, so I didn't use code to design this. And sometimes I make websites, sometimes I make brands, and sometimes I make something in between all of that. This is a game that I made a few years back called No Bad Vibes, where you try to escape the bad vibes, and if you get one, then you lose. Another thing in between that I did, this was actually the very first sort of coding fun project that I did several years ago called Give the Cat a Pizza. It's a game where you give the cat a pizza and the website refreshes itself, and it's sort of like this fun, never-ending thing. Coding is fun, and this is sort of how I figured that out. So I make websites, I make brands, I make everything in between. But what my real soft spot is where brands and technology meet. And it's not what you would think that is. This was a logo that I did very recently for an organization called Guilty by Association, shorthand GBA. It's an arts organization that is meant to elevate, give a voice to the underrepresented, undiscovered artist. So how do you represent, in order to make the art world a little bit more fair? That's kind of a heavy task, right? So how do you, using design, which is already so biased with whoever is the person designing it, namely myself, how do you make something like that represent someone else who isn't me in a way that is unbiased? Well, for this identity, by relying on the code to actually draw the letters GBA in a way that looks handwritten, that looks like someone in the middle of America who's this undiscovered, underrepresented artist took a marker or pen of their choice and just wrote it down. That I was able to rely on the code to do that, so that I wasn't the one drawing it. Instead, it was something other than myself. And there's something beautiful about being able to use code for something that needs to do that. For this identity, this was the logo. The system was very clear and simple, but the way that logo was used is almost like this graffiti-like kind of radical way of printing the logo on top of things, being able to really lean into the fact that no two logos are ever alike, because you really, every time you write the same thing in your notebook, no two ways of writing it is ever going to be alike. And the code was the thing that allowed that to happen within this system. Here's a tote bag. It doesn't actually exist. This took me a really long time to mock up. But so, like so many of you here on the call, I guess where most designers sort of come in is that this sort of love for where creative meets technical. So many designers, before they even realize that designing is a thing, there's kind of like this contrast between both of those worlds. And you'll find, and that this, as we go further in this, you'll find that kind of contrast never really went away. This was me in high school. We were dressed up for Halloween, my friend and I. We were dressed up as the 5-strand and the 3-strand of DNA. I had little car or paper cutout cytosine and guanine and adenine molecules around my neck. So always loved creative and technical. I actually started my career, like so many of you, I would imagine, doing something maybe that wasn't directly creative or design. I studied business and psychology at Carnegie Mellon, which is known for being more of like an engineering kind of school. Transferred over to Parsons, where I studied communication design. That was the total opposite. Everyone was super creative and pensive and thinking about colors and shapes in a beautiful way. And Parsons was actually where I discovered coding. Took one required coding class, and the thing with coding, and you'll see the theme of like everything since I discovered it, is that the coding is a choice. It's something that I loved so much, and I think so many people who are fascinated by it, it's this thing that you're fascinated by and you want to keep working on, and so you do it. And no one asked me to work on things. This was what we're looking at here. This was my typical Friday night would usually require me just hunkering down at school, working on some sort of code because I wanted to. Every so often, if I wanted to make it festive, I'd be like, well, it is Friday night. Maybe I'll pour myself a drink as well. But that was kind of what it was. I was always working, always trying to push myself and learn. So that's kind of like the theme. When I graduated, I had this whole knowledge of that I had been working on of coding. And that's kind of how I marketed myself. And that wasn't really I think back then that was still very fresh. It still is very fresh, but back then it was even more fresh. So graduating, I had, a degree in communication design, and the next step is usually to work at design agencies. And that's kind of the biggest question mark there. When you know how to code, how do you sort of market yourself to agencies that don't really know what to do with someone who knows how to code? I think that's still kind of a question that people are asking. It has never been not hard to find the right position for a designer coder like me, and it still remains that way. My very first job outside of school was I was lead digital at Champions Design. And Champions Design, before I got there, this is just a selection of their absolutely amazing, beautiful work. Champions Design is known for being a branding agency. They've never before me, they had very rarely dabbled in anything web, anything digital. They're always trying to push themselves. They're always on the cusp of something. And I think they trusted me heavily. They trusted my knowledge in coding and how to apply it to design. And they kind of like let me figure it out for them. And that's kind of the theme of designers who code today. There's sort of, you kind of have to try things out and break things a little bit, break the system a little bit, find people who trust you, push through to get people to trust you a little bit more. So we did I did a few jobs for them that were very digital, very web focused. We also did a lot of work that was just pure, beautiful branding, graphic design, which is really where I was able to exercise that muscle. When I left Champions Design, I knew that I wasn't getting the right focus in design and code at that agency because it was still fresh in my career and it was still fresh in this sort of like world of where design meets code. So I actually, at the time, I think I was still very young. I had very recently graduated college, and I very quickly went to being an independent designer and coder because that was in my head the only place where I knew I was going to be able to involve all of my work in that perfect combination of the two of those in a way that hasn't really been seen before. What you're seeing here is just a very small selection of some of the work that I did during that time. Both of these that you see here are technically websites. These are both things that exist on the web, but it is using the web and its capabilities and its functions as a design tool, which is the theme of my practice. It isn't your typical website. It is graphic design as we know it, but leaning in on what's possible on the web, the interactivity, the generativity, the ability to involve the user to sort of create something within that website. These are all things that the coding was able to do that I was able to rely on in the design of in my practice. Since then and now, I'm now a lead designer and coder here at Pentagram. What I do at Pentagram is I work on two teams. I work with both Georgia Loopy and Michael Beirut, which are total opposites, if you ask me. Georgia Loopy is known for the data side of things. Michael Beirut is an expert at branding. And what's interesting is that even though they are opposites, what my job is applying coding to both of those worlds, seeing how it can kind of make the data maybe more interactive, maybe make it have more sense when there's coding involved, and see how brands can kind of be expanded on and be different and be better with the involvement of coding. So just to kind of sum this up and wrap up and see how this kind of applies to you, not as much about me. I want to talk about how coding really is this new medium. Coding, design in the digital realm. This is something that for designers, it is a new way to design. It is a new medium. We haven't yet hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of the tremendous impact that designing with code can have. And it's not that there aren't enough designers who code, because there are. I know there are a lot of people on this call who know just a little bit about coding. I know every year at Parsons and all the design schools now, there's a huge amount of people who graduate knowing how to code. It's that there simply aren't enough designers who know what code can do. And just to drive that point home, I think when we think about, at least when I think about designing with code, there's kind of like this trope of, okay, maybe it's like highly pixelated, maybe there's like a lot going on. When you're designing with code, one of the things about it is that it's able to kind of make things a little bit more automated. So you can run functions several times. This kind of thing would take you a long time to create in Illustrator, but with code, it's sort of the click of a button. And as a result, you're able to kind of like easily create graphics that look like this. Apologies to the designers here. I'm not insulting your work. This is just kind of like what you think of when you think of designing with code. But for me, and kind of the message that I want to push is that designing with code is so much more than the aesthetic that comes out of it. When I design with code, I'm not doing it because I need it to look a certain way. When I design with code, I do it because I know that designing with code can solve problems like, how can the brand be responsive to the user? How can the brand be driven by the community? How can it be truly unbiased? How can it be truly transparent? How can it naturally evolve with the times? How can the brand represent everyone and still stay true to its identity? These questions and so much more are the questions that brands are really looking for the answers to now. This is sort of a turning point in design, in branding, and everything, where it's not enough just to have a beautiful logo and a beautiful color palette. The design of all of these things has to come together in a way that kind of starts to answer some of these questions. And I know that code can do this. Where you guys can screenshot this, or you'll view this after this, but this is a whole other sort of segment of my practice where I've came up with a list of the 8 methods for designing with code, and this is just kind of like the very basics of it. We're not going to go into details here, but when I say that it's more important for designers to know what code can do rather than how to code, this is kind of like that at a glance list of what it is that code can do. And there are definitely certain implications and things to keep in mind here, but just to kind of put this one up on the screen with a very pixelated background with stars and a sky, because I think it's evocative of that. But just to wrap this up and take us into the panel, I know I just ranted for a few minutes on designing and coding. But what is all that? I know that so many of you on the call don't know how to code, don't really want to know how to code, and that's totally okay. So much of my work, again, doesn't really involve code ever because it doesn't need to. So what does all this mean for me if I don't know how to code and frankly don't want to, you ask? Well, I still think that if you involve yourself in the design of anything digital, even if just a little, knowing what's possible on the web is going to be important. Again, it's not how to code, it's just knowing what's possible. Now, you could take a look at that list that I said. You can kind of like dig a little bit more into that. But really, I think the best place to sort of like start thinking about this is to keep your eyes open, look around, look at the web, look at digital things, see what's happening, but also be critical of what you see. Don't just judge it. I know we designers are very good at doing that, but be critical in the sense of analyzing it and asking yourself, how can this be helpful for my own personal practice? I know everyone here on this call is from different backgrounds, have different sort of design strategies. And I think that knowing and seeing what's possible and just kind of like challenging yourself, challenging it to kind of say how it applies to you is going to be very, very important, even if you don't know how to code. Okay, but what if I don't know how to code, but holy stromboli, this stuff is cool. Where do I start? Stuff is super cool. Where do I start? Well, what I usually recommend, if you don't want to pay for university, I'd recommend P5.js. You can screenshot this. You can take a look at this after. It's a web-based version of processing. So it's code that's meant for drawing, but since it's web-based, it's the kind of thing that you can type in a URL and share it with anyone. You don't have to download any fancy software. It will give you a fun applied way to grasp the basics. There are a ton of tutorials online, but it will not teach you how to design. I think with the whole self-teaching method of coding, again, although I took that one coding class in college, most of my work and most of my ability as a coder was because I intentionally did it. I went out and I learned P5.js, and I sort of like, I did the coding and drinking on a Friday night kind of a thing. And you can certainly do that. And I think that that's what every sort of designer who wants to dabble in coding probably needs to go through. But the one most important thing is that it's not going to teach you how to design. That's where you kind of have to take the reins and say, okay, now that I know how to write this function or sort of create this algorithm, you then have to ask yourself, well, how do I apply this to a design? And how do I make it good? How do I make it have reason? How do I make it solve this certain communication design problem that I'm used to solving in this other way? And that's where you can kind of pave the way for yourself. the last question, or second to last, how I know how to code, how do I start using it more within my practice? Again, this is the kind of thing where uh, right now coding is a new medium, and even design agencies aren't caught up to the point of where designers who know how to code are. What I recommend is to make the agencies kind of catch up to you, the person who knows how to code, is to just use it. Even if no one asks you to use it, even if you have no time to use it, just try to use it, and then do it in projects on the side, do it in projects for your clients, do it just for fun, just to kind of, first of all, exercise your own coding muscle, but then also to kind of challenge the entire world of design to see how it can be pushed further with your new applied sort of way of thinking about coding to it. So just use it. Lastly, okay, what if coding, schmoding, I just want to get a job at Pentagram? This is also a very common question that I get. And I mean this answer I really do deeply mean this answer. There really is no secret sauce. Every sort of partner is different. It usually has to do with like the right balance of timing, luck. Sometimes they're looking for a certain type of person. Sometimes they're looking for a certain type of role. It's all sort of that stuff mixed together. But I do know that everyone at Pentagram is going to be looking for good designers. And what I mean by good designers isn't just like, okay, yes, you need to have good typography. That's sort of like a given. But you need to be a designer who thinks. You need to be a designer who presents your work with reason, a designer who challenges trends. Whenever you present your work, make sure that there's kind of like this thinking behind it. This does tie into the whole designing with code thing, because again, we don't want to just code for the sake of coding. We want to code to solve a design problem. So the same thing, even if you don't know how to code, just as long as you're presenting your work with kind of like this thinking and this reasoning behind it. We'll talk about trends in just a moment with everyone else on this panel. That's kind of like the way to sum this up. So good designers, thank you. I hope that wasn't too long. And now I'm super excited to panel with you all.
That was great. Thank you, Talia. We are now moving to the panel portion of our conversation today, and I'm really lucky to be here with Talia Cotton, Renat Scherzer, and Brad to get into some of the critical thinking that Talia talked about just a moment ago. First, what I would love to do is just throw up a poll, Madeline, if you could. I'm curious who in our audience is currently working with code, and we can come back and look at those results in just a few minutes. But to start, Talia, I'm going to start off with a question to you. One thing that really stood out to me is the multidisciplinary nature of your practice. You're a designer and coder. You mentioned just now your business and psychology background. Or not, I also know that you have quite a diverse background as well. Talia, I'm curious, do you think a multidisciplinary skill set is increasingly important in design today?
That's a great question. I think, at least I know that when we interview people, when we look for new designers, it is not necessary to have more than just kind of like be a good designer. That is the most important thing. However, I also know that it's kind of like an added value if, in addition to being the good designer, you also are either good at 3D modeling or good at coding or good at animation or good at illustration. If you are a good designer plus one of those four things or maybe something else, then I know that it's kind of like that added value. Again, not a necessity, but a very big added value.
And I'm going to expand that question to the group. And Renat and Brad, please also introduce yourselves before you join our conversation. But in the current market, I mean, would you say that it's more valuable for a web designer to have deep knowledge in a particular area or to have some experience across related fields? I mean, in 2022, which has more appeal here, a specialist or a generalist?
Would you like me to jump in on that question?
Go ahead, Brad, and please introduce yourself as well.
Sure, yeah. Thank you for having me here. I'm Brad Hussey from Canada. I'm a web designer, freelancer, and content creator. So I teach all about web design, the business of web design. And I tend to come from this at the angle of more of an entrepreneurial, independent designer approach rather than one who perhaps works at an agency or is looking for career opportunities at an agency. I tend to try and show people how they can either start their own small studio, even agency, or just kind of be a really successful freelancer. And so when it comes to, uh, being a good designer, when you're running your own business, even if you're just as a freelancer, you kind of need to know a little bit of everything. So generalism is a really good trait, being able to pick up on different things. As Talia mentioned earlier, you don't need to know how to do everything. In fact, if you start going down those wormholes, you'll get lost really quickly and you'll never emerge from that any better. Uh, but when you're running your own shop or as a solo freelancer, it's really good to understand a little bit of everything and then also know who is good and who can take care of these parts for you. Whether you're building a website or you're doing a brand identity, you don't have to do everything yourself. You can assemble a team to help you do that. So my thought for the whole generalism versus specialization is, as a freelancer, it is good to have a broad understanding of everything, and perhaps for you individually, specializing in something would be a good approach as well.
Sounds like when you're a freelancer, you're almost a little bit more of a maestro, coordinating a lot of people with different talents.
Yes, absolutely.
And Renat, how about you?
Yeah, I can piggyback on what Brad has been saying. So I specifically myself, I'm a generalist. So I studied biotechnology engineering for my undergrad, and then a master in fine arts for my graduate. I'm the head, I didn't introduce myself, so I'm the head of design in Editor X. And for me, what brings me the creative thoughts that or creative solutions is that interdisciplinary, is that combination of many different fields. And I'm a generalist in who I am, but when I hire a team, as Brad was saying, I do look for those talents that will kind of work together well, that each person will know really in depth the things that I don't have the skill set to do, and that would collaboratively work well together. So I think, to Brad's point, if you are that freelancer, that person kind of orchestrating the whole show, then being a generalist is really good. And within a team, having that tone of voice or that thing that you're really good at is puts you with a really big competitive edge. So
So we've all talked about kind of the hiring leadership side of things. Let's say you're on the other side of the table. With all of this in mind, how can designers make their portfolios stand out in the hiring process? What would encourage you to pick up the phone and call an applicant back, say for a second interview?
the question for me, or
For anyone, but go ahead and start, Rena, and then anyone else.
okay, cool. So I'm a really, really big enthusiastic about designers who have a say in the world, who know what they're designing for and why they're designing. So I think Talia touched on that a bit before with the critical thinking. So I love people who have really strong voices and question everything and don't take anything for as face value, and ask why, why is it the way that it is. And also designers who are passionate about a cause or purpose or something that they would put their heart into. And specifically people who are not afraid to say the unpopular truth. So basically creative thinkers with critical thinking as well, and then I like the unpopular point of view.
What I'm hearing is talking a lot about overall values and overarching approach to design that you look for. Talia or Brad, is this something that you also look for when you're reviewing portfolios, a specific point of view, or are there other things you take into consideration as well?
Well, not necessarily. I think Renat is right. An interesting point of view is certainly one thing, and I guess from the visual side of that same question is, or that same answer is, if I'm looking at 100 portfolios, so much of the time you kind of see similar design tropes. Maybe you'll have one thing that's very loud and graphic. Maybe you'll have something that's a little bit more subdued. And the portfolios that really stand out to me and my team are the ones where it's clever and you can see the wheels of the designer turning in creating that final thing. When it is clever, it also makes it new and original. I think so much of design is, okay, well, how do you get your inspiration? How do you sort of stay fresh? And the good news is that every single design problem is unique. Every single client is unique. Every single thing that your platform is unique. And as long as you are using your brain and kind of like thinking through that problem and figuring out how to visually solve it, that's kind of where you can get to that point where there's those one or two kind of gold portfolio pieces that visually look different because they're approaching that problem from a very specific point of view. Brad, anything to add to that?
Yeah. When coming from the angle of, say, freelancing, I find a lot of freelancers get pretty confused about who they're trying to attract. And so there's a couple things we need to think about as freelancers is, you can create a portfolio and to show your work and, to highlight your abilities, your talents, your ability to communicate, your creativity and solving problems. But then there's also the freelancer who is not necessarily, say, looking for a job, and they're a free agent, but they're really what they're doing is trying to start a small studio or an agency, even if it's an agency of one where you hire people to help you on a project per project basis. And the difference here is what you communicate on your website it's not necessarily a portfolio. So if you're trying to get clients, that's very different than if you were trying to get hired by an agency. So you'll present those things very differently. And where I see some dissonance with independent designers who are trying to start up as their own business, they tend to fall back on the default, which is make a really great portfolio. But clients don't see it that way. They're not looking at it that way. They have a problem that needs to be solved, and your job is to use your ability as a designer, as an entrepreneur, to solve those problems and to communicate that on your website. So when it comes to your website as a freelancer, you need to think of it more as, how am I communicating the outcome of solving this problem to my client, rather than how am I trying to be attractive to a studio. That's kind of where I need to tend to ask people and creative designers, do you want to get a job and work for a studio or an agency and fill that role? Or do you want to strike out on your own and be independent? In which case you need to take two very different approaches. That's at least my take on it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is going to have to do with sort of which we haven't yet really addressed yet, which is sort of what it is that you're applying for. And I imagine that within the audience, some people are more interested in, generalist designer position, which we sort of spoke to. Others might have sort of other things. Others are probably trying to get a client. And I think depending on where you are, your choices on how you put your portfolio together are going to be specific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, Renat, I know today clients really expect web designers to handle projects from soup to nuts, from beginning to end. They're wearing a lot of different hats to just continue to mix metaphors here. And so that leads me to my next question for you. I mean, you lead the design team here at Editor X. My first question is really, how does this soup to nuts approach inform your work on Editor X as a product? And then second, what kinds of skills are you looking for when you're building out a well-rounded team that has to kind of meet those more holistic asks of a client today?
Sure. So I'll answer that question, I think, on with two different directions. So one is what I specifically look for within Editor X, but then what I think a creative person, emerging into their career would need in order to thrive, in order to succeed. So within my team, I look for first and foremost, good-hearted humans. I think that's the most important thing when I build a team. And yeah, being super creative, but creative in the sense that they're both, they have new outlooks on things, new approaches to how to problem solve, but also that they can collaboratively work together and come up with solutions that synergize each other, that kind of build off each other. And this is something that's really, really important for me. That the whole team will actually benefit from all the skill set within the team. And then specifically within the team, the different skill sets that I do look for, because we're product designers, because we're the people who build the web, the platform builder that you guys are using. We need people who are both, as Taya said, creatives and also analytical thinking, also technical people. And even if you don't know how to code, I really like what Talia said, even if you don't know how to code, you need to know how coding works. So even if they're not people who would sit and write code themselves, they need to know how the internet works, how coding thinks, how kind of everything is in a box within a box within a box, and how that translates into the product. So I think when we look at all those things together, it's people who can, they're not afraid of technology, that they can deal with technology and with creativity and kind of find that fluidity between things. Creative people and critical thinkers, and then of course collaborators and good humans. That's within my team. And then also it's really, really important to have people who are specialized in different fields. So for example, within my team, there's an amazing person that knows animation and interactions within the web. And so she does that part. Another person who's really specializes in education and how to teach about Editor X and how to use it. And then another one who is just brilliant product designer and knows all the ins and outs of how the platform works and how to push it to its absolute maximum. So there's the um, specialized skill sets, but then also as a team that would work together and be collaborative. So that's on the team, and maybe we'll do a round, and then also afterwards I'll say what a creative person needs in order to thrive today. My opinion.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is that people with different skill sets on the team, designers, developers, coders, producers, I would guess even copywriters who are kind of design adjacent, all really kind of have to collaborate closely and work in concert in order to, make the product that they deliver to a client. I mean, do you find, Brad or Talia, that you have to collaborate closely with people that have other skill sets? What does kind of the workflow look like for you? On the day-to-day to produce something? What does that team flow look like?
Talia, I'll let you take this one first.
Sure. For us, it's definitely case by case. A lot of the projects that I'm on are very, very small teams. Usually I'll be directing if it's within a team. Otherwise, it's sort of just like a sole thing. I'm trying to think of what's going to be a helpful way to put this. I think just to respond a little more to what Rinat was saying, which is, everyone has kind of a different background. When it comes, and also sort of slightly going back to the question about, well, what do I put in my portfolio? Is it good for me to be a generalist or that's someone with a specialty? I think at the end of the day, your biggest value to a team, to a job, to whatever position you're looking for is going to be yourself, whatever it is. If you are a generalist, and don't force yourself to try to be specialized in 3D modeling, just figure out what it is that kind of you love, that kind of makes your design clock tick, and find a way to kind of market that, present yourself in that way. Because when it comes to hiring, when it comes to working in a team, if there is room for you, if there is a place for you and what you do and how you market yourself, then people will pick you up, and there will be a place for you. I think there's something kind of reassuring in that. I know that with so much of this like talk of like, well, what do I need to be? I think just be yourself, and don't just be yourself. Be yourself, but also find a way to like make it look like the 100% version of yourself to everyone else, because that's kind of like that's what brand that's where it comes in. That's where people are going to be able to see you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to kind of sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, just to kind of add to that, because I like to also come from the angle of freelancing, where we can get pretty confused. And so when you're doing your own solo thing, don't be afraid to be really specific in a number of things. Who who your work is for, who your business is for, who your solutions are for. What I like to say, what is it that they suffer with? And I use that term really intentionally because, yeah, and this goes for any design. If you're trying to solve a problem, well, what's a problem? I have an itch on my back. I could scratch it myself on the door jamb. It's not a very big problem. But if you have something that you are suffering with, that's something that you need somebody else to help you with. And so in that case, if you can determine, specifically who you want to serve, what they suffer with, and how you can solve that problem for them. So, i.e., in your design work as a web designer, building specific solutions, whether through code or design, if you can nail those three things down and be really specific, that's going to have a resonating effect. That's going to, a lot of designers are afraid, well, if I'm really specific, I'm turning away lots of potential work and opportunities. The reality is when you're talking to everybody, you're talking to nobody. But if you're talking to somebody, then other people will want to listen because you have their attention. And that somebody that you're designing for, that you're talking to, that you're trying to connect to, there are other people like them, and they will listen in, and their ears will perk up, and it has a kind of a resonating effect. So don't be afraid in your work in your design work, in your portfolio, in your specifically website, when you're trying to build your practice, to be really specific for who it's for and how you can serve them.
Brad, that's great. That actually dovetails really nicely with a question that's in our Q&A. So I'm going to give it to you right now, just because it fits so well with what we're talking about. How can you better understand the audience that you're designing and building for?
Well, I think it needs to connect it to what everybody's been saying so far. It's like you need to stand for something, and when you stand for something, it's easier for you to lead from that. And when you are yourself, and as Talia said, like when you're like the 100% version of yourself, and you're not diluting it to appeal a little bit over here and a little bit over here, you're just being yourself fully. That naturally you're going to design and build your business or your design career from an angle that actually means something, and that's attractive to people. So rather than just looking around and looking for an audience to design and build for, because that's kind of arbitrary, you can just pick a name out of a hat, pick an industry out of a hat. But if it doesn't align with your values or something that you're excited to get up and solve problems for or to serve, then that's not going to last very long. But if you actually stand for something, then you can minimize and limit your choices to the audiences you want to design, build, and serve. It'll be a lot easier. And then you can ask those questions. Once you pick one of a few audiences that you're really excited about, you could go, well, what do they suffer with? And how can I serve them and solve that and eradicate that suffering for them in my designs, in my offerings, in my, services, all of these things. So that's the angle that I would take.
This is actually a big debate between myself and a couple of my friends, colleagues, is do you only design for what you specialize in or what your interests are? Or my personal opinion is that a good designer can design for any audience, because a good designer puts themselves aside, puts their specialty aside, puts their opinions aside, puts their backgrounds aside, in that research phase, in that portion where when you're trying to understand your client, I think, how can you better understand the audience you're designing building for? Just take all of it. If you can empty your brain of everything you know, then do that. Ask them the questions. Try to be, it's an exercise in being an unbiased person. It's an exercise in trying to understand people, see where they're coming from, reading between the lines. Sometimes we have to understand them better than they understand themselves, and that takes a very specific kind of sharp way of reading people, of conversing with people. Making them feel comfortable, something about allowing them to open up to you. I definitely having a specialty and having a certain type of client that you like to design for is definitely good, because then it can be more of a conversation. It's less of like a question and answer and trying to understand the client. Like in my dream world, I'd be, I don't know, designing for like academics and like technology firms, but because I know that stuff. But I don't. My favorite projects to design for are the ones that I know nothing about, because it's kind of like, it forces me to use my design muscle, which is like putting myself aside. So two kind of ways of thinking about it. Neither one is wrong.
I can continue on that. It's really interesting. I have a lecture that I give at Parsons called The Art of Unlearning, and it really ties well with what you said about like how to empty your brain and just be in the presence of someone else. And the field that I come from in the design world is human-centered design. Is really how can you be with another human, understand their problems, kind of really go into the depth of what they're saying and what they're not saying, and then kind of analyze it and come up with a new solution. And so I think I really love the idea of like emptying your brain and just coming completely new with those fresh eyes to a new audience, to the audience that you're designing for. And I would just add to that, there are a few, design research methods. Of course, being with them, interviewing them, shadowing them. But the one that I love the most, and maybe that would be helpful for Lucia, is to actually do the tasks that they need to do. So once you try to take on the task that your audience needs to do, you kind of feel firsthand their pain points and their challenges. And for me, that is the best way for me to understand my clients, my audiences. And so I try to actually really immerse myself in the world of my of the audience that I'm designing for.
That's wonderful. Just to kind of like sum this up on like the most positive note that we'll probably reach on this whole panel, which is very related. I think that my personal philosophy is that I know that recently, especially due to COVID, a lot of the questions are like, well, can design save the world? How important really is our job? And I like this sort of perspective on what makes a good designer. I like that to shift the question away from can design save the world and more on the answer of, well, designers technically, in order to be a good designer, you have to be a good person. And that's just something that's really nice, a nice kind of like thing to have, even though we're not, literally in hospitals, literally physically saving people's lives. We are, in a way, by the way that we think, by the way that we're able to kind of like converse with people, relate to people, that kind of thing. In a way, we have potential to make the world a better place, even if it's not through our designs, but if it's through our way of thinking and sort of responding to the world around us.
Yep.
That's great. I mean, in some way, we're building, or web designers are building systems, right? They're building the systems that people use to function in the day-to-day. That brings me to our next question, which is somewhat of an unknown system as it currently exists, and that is the Metaverse. There's been a lot of hype around the topic over the past year, especially. Should we care? Should we not care? I mean, there's ongoing Twitter debates about this too. What we are seeing, though, is that in e-commerce, events, co-working products, a lot more industries, frankly, they are trending towards the use of AR, VR, and in some places, kind of a nascent metaverse experience. There's also been an influx of cash into the space, as well as Web3 products. I'm curious just to get your takes on this. I mean, how do we expect these new technologies to impact web designers, if at all? I mean, from a near future perspective and a longer term perspective. Anyone who wants to take that, feel free.
Yeah, I can start with maybe like my thoughts on I don't know. First of all, there are many possible and plausible ways this can go. But what I am seeing really strongly is that the boundaries between our reality and the virtual reality are shifting and dissolving. And I assume that with time that goes by, these boundaries are gonna, dissolve, reform, form again, then dissolve again. And so I think that the movements between the two worlds will be more, the cadence will be quicker. And I can't see a future where this is not part of our reality in some way. I don't know if it will be the metaverse or some evolution of it, but the movement between our physical reality and the virtual reality will become much more intertwined, as I see it.
Talia or Brad?
I'll go kind of a quick answer, but there's a lot to it. So one of my clients right now is their product, their everything that they involve themselves in is the metaverse, and they joked that when you input anything about Web3 in Dolly, the AI generator that kind of generates images based on text prompts, it always comes out purple. And it's true. If you do anything Web3, even in Google search, you're going to get purple. Now, where that comes from, I have no idea. I don't know how somehow the aesthetic of Web3 became purple. It's not just the only aesthetic, it's also like 3D. And my response to that question is kind of like in two realms. The first one is, well, how do you design for something that revolves around the ideas of Web3? Do you make it purple in 3D? The second question is also, how do you design using the technologies that revolve around Web3? For the first part, do we use purple and 3D when we're designing for Web3? My answer is that, like so many things, it's going to be, yes, the aesthetic is going to play a role because now those things are kind of like subconsciously associated with Web3. So keep that in mind. But for me, when you're designing for Web3, you want to, and this kind of goes into like, well, how do you understand your client? Web3, the basis of it is kind of the intersection of a lot of voices. Web3 is now this new technology that's allowing people everywhere to kind of have these digital conversations to overly simplify the term. But the idea is that it is this community engaging thing. Now, what the design that is Web3, that has nothing to do with purple and 3D. What I would do if I were to design something for Web3 is I would say, well, how do I design something that is community focused and involves everyone to sort of create the design in a way? Coding can do that. The second, that's very rough. But the second question is, well, what about the technologies that allow Web3 to be itself? Sort of, do we learn it? Do we figure out what it can do? And for that, I would address that as I would address code, which is that we haven't really hit the tip of the iceberg yet in terms of what coding can do for design. I think Web3 right now is just emerging as a functionality. It's a thing. It's a new technology, and in time, I'm sure there will be people, experts who kind of involve themselves in that technology and ask themselves, how does it apply to the design world? My personal opinion is that if you don't delve into that at all, you're going to be fine. Like, graphic design isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But there is kind of like this new, if you're interested in kind of pushing the boundaries of graphic design, we now have this new technology. Why not go delve into it and see what it can do?
Yeah, I think like the whole metaverse concept in Web3, a lot of people think it's like this is the future and this is absolutely where everything's going, and we're all going to be wearing goggles and looking at real life through, this virtual medium. Or designers think, like you said, it's purple and 3D and like animated. You're like, well, Web3 isn't like a design aesthetic or like a design look and feel. It's just kind of a response to culture and the world and how people interact with technology and the web. That's, and so to look at Web3 and the whole metaverse and to completely dismiss it, which I admit sometimes I'm just like, that's not going anywhere. Like not everyone's going to want to experience the web and technology that way. But also, like, what do I know? Like, I can't see the future. And the reality is it's probably, we have this idea, or Web3 enthusiasts and metaverse, the whole metaverse mania, they have an idea of where it's going. And the reality is it's probably just going to be a general kind of accepted evolution of how the internet works and how we interact with technology. It's probably going to be a more sophisticated way of interacting with virtual reality rather than this crazy sci-fi Jetsons sort of vibe. Where do you really need to go down that path and understand blockchain and Web3 and the metaverse and all this stuff to be successful in the design and web design world? I agree with you, Talia. Probably not. It's just going to be a gradual evolution. I don't think we're at a crossroads and there's like a gatekeeper saying, are you going to accept the future of Web3 technology? If yes, this is the path to success. If no, well, then you're going to die off. I don't think that's the case at all. I just think it's just a gradual evolution of technology on the internet and just a response to how creators and designers and people who want to make stuff for the internet, they just want a more collaborative way. They want a decentralized way so that it's more back in the hands of the people who create rather than in small pockets of large gatekeepers, if that makes sense. That's kind of where my brain goes on that.
Yeah, I think so. Overall, it seems to me that we're in a really interesting time when it comes to web and digital design. On the one hand, from an economic standpoint, we're seeing kind of a constriction in some ways. We're also seeing new technologies emerge. We're seeing new incorporation of design at a business level. I'm curious overall, and this question is for all three of you, as we look down the road of, say, the next 5 years or so, what do you think the web design industry will look like? What will change between now and then?
The next how many years?
I would say 5 or so, but you can go bigger if you want to go bigger.
I don't know. Does anyone?
Yeah.
I guess my initial hunch is, although technology moves and evolves fairly quickly, I'm seeing that designing with technology is not evolving at a fast of a rate, and that's because when you look at the FedEx logo, it's a brilliant logo. It doesn't need technology. You can have really good graphic design without any of that stuff, and so many designers are kind of like taking that route, and that's okay. What will it look like? I think probably very similar to what it is now, but there might just be more great things out there. I don't know. I think that's kind of like a wonderful opportunity that we all have right now to figure out.
I completely agree. And I also think that if we look at the trends report that just came out, we do see a lot of what Talia is talking about. We do see a lot of that, generative art and that kind of like the mesh between art and design, and then how can we use code to push those boundaries of that happening more. And on one hand, and on the other hand, if we look at, for example, one of the themes there is kitsch design, is that kind of going back to basic, going back to like the tangible, like everyday objects, and kind of bringing that back into web design. And so yeah, I think it's like everything, there's a lot of pendulum of back and forth, but I do foresee more code going into design.
Yeah, Rena, I think you make a great point bringing up the kind of this nostalgia for the early web. We're seeing, Y2K nostalgia generally, but in particular in kind of like a web digital design use case towards like a time when just like the internet was like a little bit more weird and there were less templates and, so as kind of a counterpoint to the super slick kind of metaverse aesthetic that we're seeing in some other categories. So interesting to see how those two kind of, butt up against each other. So we've been talking at a macro level. I now want to get into a micro level question, and that is really has to do with some actionable items for our guests here today as they leave the panel. The job market is really in flux right now. I'm curious, what's one thing that designers should do right after this panel to navigate it successfully and to make some traction, in their career's next steps? Do you have any recommendations as far as or best practices for you, say like when you're job hunting, or what you would look for? We talked a bit about your side of the table. What's something, if you were applying for your next job, that you would want to make sure that you have?
This is kind of maybe, I don't want to say avoiding the question, but it's still my answer. I think the one thing I would tell people to do to advance their career right after this call or this panel is to send that email. And what I mean by that is stop editing your portfolio. Obviously, you can keep editing your portfolio, but before you do that, or whatever it is, just apply for that job. If it's something that you doubt yourself for, just do this. Every single email that I send to this day, I know you guys don't believe me, but I swear to God, I do this more often than not, because I'm scared. I'm scared to send the email requesting a job, requesting something, and I just do it, because that's the thing that's going to get you further than changing the typeface on your portfolio.
So I like it. You're very down to earth, and I'll answer my bird's eye view. Maybe is just decide what it is you, or not decide. Decide is a big word, but think of what you're really passionate about changing in the world, and then go for that. Go for those jobs. I don't know. I know that I'm a huge advocate for things around gender equality, and a lot of the design work that I've done have been around that. And so kind of like not narrowing, but maybe kind of focusing on what your heart desires to use your voice as designers, and apply for jobs that are within that realm.
Yeah. And to add to it from an independent designer's perspective, don't be afraid to kind of look stupid. Like, don't feel like you need to be perfect and to write the email perfectly, or to design the website perfectly, or to make sure your sales page is just so, like, just don't be afraid to make a bit of noise, because we have access to the entire internet connected world. And some of those people are the people that are going to be hiring you, or contracting you, or collaborating with you, or singing your praises. And when you create something, and when you build something, and you make something, and you take it off of your hard drive and put it out for the world to see, interact with, play with, experience, that in and of itself is your portfolio. It's not necessarily your curated, nice portfolio website, but your portfolio of work, your creations, and the things that you do. And those things affect people, and it has an infinite effect in the internet world. I could create something today and think, this is garbage. I could either delete it, or I could publish it, and just whatever. And I've certainly done that over the last 10 to 15 years, where I have almost not published something. And it is that very thing that got me an email from somebody saying, I really liked that, or that helped me, or that redirected my path, or in a more specific sense, got me a job opportunity. So don't be afraid to make some noise, and then listen for some signal, because you get to do that. You don't need permission to do that. If you do, here's your permission. Just hit publish.
The one thing I'll add, now that it's gone a full round and I've had a little bit more time to think, and this is legit feed. This is gonna apply to every single person in the audience, no matter what stage of the career you're in, no matter what job you're looking for, no matter where your portfolio is. I would say, work on your elevator pitch. Work on the one sentence in a dozen words or less, like 10 words. that says what it is that you do, what makes you special, what is your passion. What my elevator pitch was when I finalized it and refined it after I graduated college, like a couple years after, is I'm a designer and coder, and I specialize in the intersection of branding and technology. And that is it. And every single bit of my work that I sort of put in my portfolio fits that elevator description, that elevator pitch. What's nice about having an elevator pitch is twofold. First of all, in dialogue, it's really great to just have that line, if you're in the elevator, to just like send it, and so people understand who you are. That's one. The second place where the elevator pitch is, I think, even more valuable is in your portfolio itself. Before you get to the content, before you get to the beautiful visuals, I just want that one liner that says who you are and gives me an intro into what it is I'm about to be seeing. What are the two things that you do? What are the three things that you do? Are you a generalist? What makes you special? If the place where you're from adds to your work, add that in it, but only if it does. Again, fewest words as possible, but sort of give me the general sense of what it is that you do in those few words.
Talia, that's great. I expect everyone to hit send on an email that's been in their drafts for the past week after this. Work on that elevator pitch. I think that your elevator pitch also speaks to what Renat was talking about in reference to having a point of view. And Brad, you touch on, when you publish something, when you kind of overcome that fear, it can open a lot of doors for you. And I think those are all important takeaways for our audience right now before we move to the Q&A. So we have just shy of 20 minutes left here, and we are now going to open it up to questions from the audience. So Madeline, I know you are in the ether somewhere, so you're going to help me with this. Essentially, what we're going to do is bring some of the questions with the most upvotes to the stage. So you can ask your question face-to-face with our panel of experts here. I'm going to start with Sharon B, who has a question about the EditorX platform specifically. Sharon B, go ahead.
Hi, Lily. I just pulled Sharon's question up onto stage as it was just typed. So she asks, how does EditorX compare to other website builders?
Okay. Thanks, Madeline. And Renat, I think that one's for you.
Cool. So maybe I'll go full circle into what I think creators or designers today need to do in order to thrive. And when I try to think about it before this panel, I think in my opinion, it breaks down to three components. One of them is creativity. And so that kind of branches out to two different things. Is one, having that talent, and then second of all, being constantly inspired. And so that's one pillar of what a designer needs to thrive. The second one is having the technology and the tools to do that and to execute your ideas. And then the third one is having a warm community, a place where you can ask questions, receive answers, get supported, have a support system. And I think with EditorX, it really touches on those 3 points. So if we start with the third one, with the community, we have an amazing Facebook group and forum within EditorX. And then we have people like Brad who have their own channel, explaining people or teaching people or sharing with people their experience of how to use the platform in the best possible way. And so that's on that pillar. On the inspiration side, we have both the content on the builder itself. So there's a lot of different compositions and presets that you can use that are already pre-designed, and you can piggyback on that. And we have our amazing blog, Lily Shaping Design, which you're the editor of. And so that's kind of places where we open our users into what's happening in the world, into expanding your capabilities and your capacity as a designer. And then the third, and maybe the thing that brings it into fruition, is kind of the tools, the technology that we have. And so the technology, I would want to touch base on two things that kind of stand out with our competitors. Is one, everything that you design on Editor X is completely responsive. And so responsive is a big buzzword with web design, but basically what it means is that it's pixel perfect, whatever, to no matter what screen size that you have. So whether it's a huge screen or a little 13-inch laptop or your mobile, it will look perfect and responsive to whatever that screen is. And that is something that we specialize in, and we know to do it without you having to code anything. And then on the other side, there's all the business solutions that we provide that actually allow you to grow your business and your clients' businesses. So whether it's e-commerce, if you're creating a website for an online store, we have all the business capabilities for that. If you have, for example, an event venue and you want to have bookings for that event venue, that's something that we provide. If you have a little boutique hotel, or your client has a boutique hotel and you want to help them also be able to for their users to be able to book rooms. And so all the different business solutions is really what puts us ahead of our competitors. And yeah, and what the other things that I said, which is the inspiration and the warm community.
So to your point on inspiration, we have another question that is related to that rather broad and nebulous category. So what are the best practices for when one finds themselves without any design inspiration? What do you do when you feel like you're in it, you're in an inspiration rut? And that is from Kira M.
Can I take this one first?
Yeah, Talia, go for it.
Everyone jump in. The first thing that I do is I close my computer, I step away from it, I go for a walk. I try not to think about design because I think usually that break is kind of very necessary. And however long that break requires, depending on obviously deadlines and whatnot, you take it because it's very important. Inspiration is a very, it's a sensitive word for me because in my head, good design doesn't necessarily need inspiration. Good design needs research. Whenever I'll give you an example of a project that I'm working on right now, like 10 minutes before this panel, the client just came back and said, "We love everything that you just did, but can you try something along these lines?" And I was talking with Michael Beirut, and we were like, "What on earth?" And what my strategy is going to be doing is I'm going to close my computer. I'm going to close all my design books. I'm going to go to my notepad. I'm going to think for about 15 minutes and just see if I can solve the problem with just the vague sort of sketches on a piece of paper. And it really is about, I need to refresh my memory of what is the problem that they're trying to be solving? What is their audience? What are the sort of visual cues that alludes to these various things that they're going to be doing? And I sketch it out and I kind of like do that. I think the second part to this question is I personally, I don't look for inspiration in most places. I follow the least amount of people on social media. I don't really look at design blogs other than just to kind of like know what's going on in the design world because I'm afraid that the visuals that I see in the world around me are going to kind of like bias my design when it comes to sort of designing on the page. And it's so true when that happens. So the least kind of visual things I have, the more I know that my ideas are going to be as creative as I can be, but also that they're going to be unique to the client, unique to the problem, that whole thing. So the last thing I would do is scroll through Instagram and see what other people have done. The first thing I would do is close my computer and start from a blank piece of paper and a pen.
I love that answer.
That's a cool approach. I like that.
Renat,
do you have something to add to that one?
Yeah, I want to add to that. So for me, taking a break and like putting your shutting down your computer in this part of the body, I think that's one of the most important things. And doing something completely different. Like I would just like, as you said, go for a walk, have a shower, call a friend, have something amazing to eat, something like that. That would kind of cut the rat race. And then for me, the place for inspiration, I love what you said that you don't scroll down social media, and I'm the same. And what I do is usually look at nature. I just go out and look at a tree and how it operates. And it kind of ties back into something that you said in the beginning, Talia, about that you really appreciate clever design when you see how kind of the wheels were turning. And for me, nature is the most clever thing in the world. So just going out and looking at a tree, looking at how a leaf is, the structure of a leaf and the different colors and how the light shines through, and just focusing on something very, very external from the human experience and into nature just always brings back amazing things into the world.
Yeah, that's so cool. It's like you're looking at, by going out into nature, putting the phone away, jumping into like a cold lake or something like this. It's like looking at nature as your way of seeing the ultimate design. You know, when you look at a leaf, it's not nothing. It's expertly designed. So as a designer,
Mhm.
to look for, where do you find the best design inspiration? It's probably not an Instagram hashtag. You're probably going to find some nice work because, of course, that's where people share their stuff. But if you go way, 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 way back and you look at a tree, or you watch the ocean waves, or you experience just the world around you, that's kind of the ultimate design. And you can see how it works. And so from there, how do you apply that into like a nice website with a nice color palette? It's like, well, okay, design, no matter the trends, no matter the buzzwords, no matter the metaverse or the goggles or any of this stuff or the tools, it always comes down to, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, but it just comes down to some simple principles. Design is a set of systems, not necessarily just art. It can be, but it's a set of systems, it's principles. And you can always fall back on that. So if you're getting inspiration from everything outside of your digital devices and you're getting it from nature, you're getting it from a human experience, from food, how do you apply that to something practical on the screen? Well, if you know the principles and you practice and learn and study and train yourself on the principles of good design, good typography, good spacing, good white space, all of this stuff, then you can apply that. And it can be very simple. And you bring in little bits of what we know today as nice looking design, and let it kind of come in a little bit. But you get to control what comes in once you've kind of eradicated all the noise that's telling you this is good design, more rounded corners, more gradients, less of this. Step way out of that principle-based approach and let in little tiny bits of the rest.
That's great. I have another question from James Azur, and he's wondering, how do you pair design with customer user experience needs? How do you balance those two things?
Is that kind of like as though those two things are separate?
That's a good one.
That's a great question. I'm sensing that maybe they're integral and intuitive in the same kind of way. Can you talk a little bit about that, Dahlia?
Yeah, I mean, this may be repeating ideas at this point, but I don't know if you guys can hear New York in the background, but
I hear New York. It's all good. We got the vibe. Love it.
I love New York. Sure, whatever. How do you pair design with customer user experience needs? For me, it's the same thing. There is no design without those needs. And that just goes back to asking the client, researching the subject, and really understanding what those things are. I think where the designer comes in is understanding how visual things can solve that problem, understanding the implications of a red circle, a certain typeface, a certain character in a certain typeface, and how that applies to how that solves the customer user experience needs. That's from a branding perspective. I'm sure Renat and Brad have other perspectives as well.
Yeah, I'm going to 100% agree with you on that. The question of, are they different things? Because then when you ask the question, and this isn't against James or anything, because a lot of us will ask that question, how do you make, like, I have really cool creative design ideas, And how do I make sure that I'm doing all the proper things for user experience and accessibility and all these things? Design isn't a color palette or a border radius or a padding. Design, that's not what design is. Design is, I have my keyboard and it's been organized in such a fashion that I'm able to connect my brain to this, to the computer, to be able to communicate something. This was designed. It wasn't, hey, this is a cool series of mechanical buttons that people that I've organized at random. No, they are very expertly designed, from the positioning to the angle, everything. Now the color and the mechanical design of this thing, okay, they thought of that. The space gray, the brushed aluminum, of course, but that's an extension of design. The Shaquille says little d versus big D design. Little d design is like, my table is white because it's a minimalist table and looks nice in my studio. The big D design is that it's a sit and stand desk that I can adjust to my perfect height to solve the problem that not every desk fits the same size person. So that's kind of like my extension to what you were saying there.
Yeah, I think the fundamental terminology of what design is and the difference between art and design. Art is there to evoke emotion, to evoke aesthetics, and then design is the use of aesthetics in order to solve a problem. That is the definition of it. So the user experience is intrinsic into the design or the visual aesthetics of whatever it is.
I think another way of phrasing the question, which is also a question I get pretty often, is how do you deal with a bad client? It's kind of a what if the client is telling you, yeah, but I want it to be red, and you're like, no, but it can't be red, it has to be blue. I think I think so much of what makes a good designer is, again, your ability to kind of like, if I'm convinced that red is the answer and the client doesn't agree with me, maybe the client is right. I think it's kind of a service type mentality where you just got to hear them out and maybe try to make it work. At a certain point, designing for a client is just adding a few more limitations on your design, and that's what makes for good design anyway, is having limitations. So that's good. But the last sort of part to that is there's like 5% of the time where the client is definitely not right, and the way around that is really good persuasive skills. Try to convince them in without try to sorry try to make them believe that it was their idea to make it red instead of blue. 5% of the time. The other 95% of the time, they're right, and add it to your design limitations.
Yeah.
I love that the skills of persuasion are almost just as important as, all the graphic design essentials, maybe just as important. I know we have about, I'd say, a minute and a half left. I have a rapid fire question for Talia before we wrap. It's really twofold. I think it should be easy for you. But one is, if you're a graphic designer and you're looking to jump into coding, learn more coding, is there a short list of resources or libraries that you would recommend? And then two, let's say you're already doing creative coding. What kind of languages would you recommend that they use?
Yeah, great questions. Rapid fire. If you're just starting out, you don't have a teacher, you don't have a class, none of that stuff. The JavaScript, the coding, everything that I would sort of dive into head first is called P5JS. It is the web-based version of processing, which is a software which is meant for kind of drawing with code. What P5JS uses is JavaScript. It's kind of like a different version of JavaScript in a way. It uses slightly different words and slightly different syntaxes, but it is coding that's meant for drawing. It is coding that's meant for rectangles and circles and moving things around the page. And it will be the thing that gets you thinking like a coder, experimenting with conditionals and loops and automation and all of that stuff. That's a very good in. There are so many really good tutorials online for that as well. Just YouTube P5JS tutorial and go for it. The one thing I'll add there, and I think I said this at the very start, the one thing I'll add there is just because you know how to code doesn't mean you know how to design with code. So as you're going through these tutorials and the person on the YouTube is saying, okay, now we're going to make this thing look cool, ask yourself, yeah, great, I can make it look cool, but how can this apply to design? How can this solve a problem? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I'm seeing some people saying the coding train, choo. Yes, the coding train is a wonderful resource. It's taught by a wonderful individual with great energy, and do it. The second question is, what if you already know how to code? What sort of languages do you use? My primary language is vanilla JavaScript. Vanilla JavaScript is a programming language, so it allows you to do all of the programmatic stuff, meant specifically for browsers. It is one of the most commonly used languages. Vanilla JavaScript, the reason that I don't do any sort of like fancy, I can use React, but I don't. And that's because so many of the designs that I do are for logos or posters or literal like designs that are made with code. And for that, you don't need any fancy frameworks. You just need the ability to write an algorithm. And JavaScript is kind of like the language that's the most accessible for me because it's a web-based thing. So you don't need to do anything fancy, just kind of like the basics, kind of get that syntax right, and that's pretty much all you're going to need to do. At the very end of the day, the theme of all of this is just because you know how to code doesn't mean you know how to design with code. And that's where you, as you're learning these things, you're going to have to challenge yourself. You're going to have to stop yourself, ask questions, ask your fellow designers to critique your design that's made with code, so that you're pushing yourself as a designer. You're not just learning how to use this tool, you're also learning how to use the tool.
Thanks, Talia. With that, I want to say thank you to our audience for taking time out of your day to join us, and so thankful to Talia and Rinat and to Brad for spending part of your day with us. There are so many great takeaways here. I can't wait to unpack it all, and if anyone in the audience wants to listen again, there will be a recording sent via email tomorrow, so you can dig in deep, screenshot from Talia's presentation. Also, please check out the trend report, which is on the Shaping Design website now. And if you're curious as to how our incredible in-house design team built it, we're going to be having a how-to webinar on how to do just that on August 3rd. So with that, thank you again, Talia, Rinat, and Brad, and to our audience. Good designers, good people make good designers, and send those emails. Thanks, everyone. Have a great
Thanks, everyone.
day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.